And welcome to Hannity tonight. ISIS is right here on American soil. The House Homeland Security Chairman says there are now 1,000 investigations into the terror group spread out across all 50 states. And today, ISIS allegedly released a brand new video showing jihadists promising more attacks in France and vowing to blow up the White House. Now, this all comes in the wake of reports earlier today that 2 Syrian families were detained along our southern border in Laredo, Texas. Now, U.S. authorities are saying that there are no known terror ties, but it shows just how easy it would be for terrorists to enter into the homeland. Now, despite all of this, President Obama is flat out ignoring the real threats, and instead, well, he's focusing on attacking Republicans. Watch this.
When individuals say that we should have a religious test and that only Christians, proven Christians, should be admitted, that's offensive and contrary to American values. I cannot think of a more potent recruitment tool for ISIL than some of the rhetoric that's been coming out of here. Now, first they were worried about the press being too tough on them during debates. Now they're worried about 3-year-old orphans. That doesn't sound very tough to me.
And that's not all. President Obama continues to spew dangerous rhetoric about the Syrian refugees. Watch this.
The idea that somehow they pose a more significant threat than all the tourists who pour into the United States every single day just doesn't jive with reality. That's not what our law enforcement thinks.
And here now with Reaction 2016 GOP presidential candidate, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, I think when the president was talking about the religious test, which is offensive and contrary to our values and a recruitment tool, he was talking about you, and I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, you know, it really is remarkable that twice this week President Obama has attacked me directly. And both times he's done so from foreign soil. First in Turkey, where he called me un-American, and then in Manila, where he said I was offensive. And apparently what he deems offensive is what you and I and millions of Americans have been saying, which is that the Obama-Clinton plan to bring in tens of thousands of Syrian Muslim refugees to America is utter lunacy. At a time when ISIS has declared war, at a time when radical Islamic terrorists want to murder as many Americans as possible, at a time when the Obama administration admits it can't vet these refugees. The head of the FBI said they lack the information to be able to ascertain whether these refugees are in fact ISIS terrorists. It is the essence of reasonableness and common sense to say we shouldn't be bringing in tens of thousands of refugees who may include ISIS terrorists. And yet Obama, instead of defending this nation, just attacks you and me and every American who wants to keep this nation safe.
You know, he just said that this is no dangerous than any tourist coming to America. Now, I'm going to play for you Obama's top envoy in the coalition to defeat ISIS. That's General John Allen. And I'll play for you the FBI director, James Comey, and the assistant director, Steinbeck, and the National Intelligence Director, James Clapper. They're all saying that ISIS will very likely infiltrate the refugee community, which, by the way, is exactly what they did in France. And he says no different than a tourist. I want to play it for you and our audience so they know what our intelligence officers are saying about this.
Right.
Would that bring in Syrian refugees pose a greater risk to Americans?
I mean, it's clearly a population of concern.
The concern is in Syria, the lack of our footprint on the ground in Syria, that the databases won't have the information we need. So it's not that we have a lack of process, it's there's a lack of information.
And that obviously raises grave concern as to being able to do proper background checks of the individuals coming into the country.
Yes.
I don't obviously put it past the likes of ISIL to infiltrate operatives among these refugees.
We can only query against that which we have collected. And so if someone has never made a ripple in the pond in Syria in a way that would get their identity or their interests reflected in our database, we can query our database till the cows come home, but we're not going to, there will be nothing show up because we have no record on that person.
There is some fear that some of these refugees may actually be posing as refugees, but they might actually be Al-Qaeda or ISIS terrorists trying to sneak into Europe or the United States. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly that's a possibility. I mean, you can't dismiss that out of hand. We should be conscious of the potential that Daesh may attempt to embed agents within that population.
You know, Senator, if the president refuses to listen to our top law enforcement and intelligence community, it seems to me he is willing to gamble with the lives of the American people. How can this be stopped?
You know, Sean, you are exactly right. This president is so driven by radical ideology, by political correctness. I mean, remember, this is a president who refuses to say the words radical Islamic terrorism, just like Hillary Clinton in the Democratic debate. She could not utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. If they won't define the enemy, then they don't acknowledge the simple reality that they can't vet whether the people they're bringing in are terrorists, and it is profoundly dangerous. Now, you ask, what can we do about it? I am leading the fight in the Senate to stop Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's plan to bring in tens of thousands of Syrian Muslim refugees. Today, I went to the Senate floor and brought forward two pieces of legislation I've introduced. The first is the Expatriate Terrorist Act. This is common sense legislation that says if an American citizen goes and joins ISIS, if he takes up arms against America and wages jihad against this nation, that by doing so, he or she loses their American citizenship. We shouldn't have ISIS terrorists coming back to America using U.S. passports in order to then wage jihad and try to murder innocent Americans. The second legislation is legislation that I've introduced that would block Syrian refugees and refugees from Iraq and from Libya from coming over nations where al-Qaeda and ISIS control large portions of territory. It would block those refugees from coming in so that we don't expose ourselves to the national security risk. Now, listen, there's a humanitarian crisis, but these refugees can be resettled in the Middle East, in majority Muslim countries. We're already providing, we're paying more of that bill than any country on earth, and yet the president insists we have to endanger the safety and security of our nation. And I'll tell you what, Sean, when I brought both of these up on the Senate floor, the Senate Democrats stood up and objected. You know, Pat Leahy echoed President Obama's attack. He said it was anti-American, and he said, gosh, his ancestors were Irish and Italian, and we didn't block them. And I responded to Pat Leahy. I said, you know what? On my mother's side, my ancestors were Irish and Italian. The difference was they weren't coming here to blow up and murder innocent civilians. And if the Democrats can't tell the difference between immigrants coming, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and people who may be radical Islamic terrorists, that's what's wrong with the Obama foreign policy in the first place.
There's something that I think too few people are willing to have an honest discussion about, and that is there is a clash of cultures. In other words, the values of people that grow up, for example, under Sharia law, if that's what you grew up under, and you think women shouldn't be able to drive, and women can't be seen in public without a male relative, and you need 4 male eyewitnesses for a woman to prove rape, and many countries practice Sharia, how do we ascertain whether or not you still hold those values but still want to live in America, or maybe even more extreme values? There's no vetting process that I can think of that will ascertain what is in the human heart, especially because terrorists, aren't they trained to lie to people that would interview them if we're vetting them?
They are, and indeed there is a religious philosophy in Islamism that encourages them to lie to carry out jihad. And you know, if you look at Islamism, it is a theocratic and political ideology that says that they are compelled to use violence and force to murder anyone that doesn't share their radical faith or to forcibly convert them. And it is a cancer, and we will not defeat radical Islamic terrorism unless and until we have a commander-in-chief willing to say those words.
In light of the refugees, Senator, that committed these atrocities, these terror attacks in France, the Democrats seem like they're willing to gamble with the lives of Americans. Now, let's assume that one of the refugees, you know, one of these ISIS members infiltrates the refugee population, and they do commit acts of terror. Who will have blood on their hands?
Well, listen, we know they did that in Europe. We know that at least one of the terrorists who committed these horrible attacks in Paris came in with the refugees, and President Obama and Hillary Clinton and the Democrats are willing to allow those same refugees to come to our shores, and apparently they're willing to just roll the dice and take the risk that hundreds or, God forbid, thousands of Americans will be murdered by jihadists. And, you know, one of the things that's striking, Sean, you know what seemed to make President Obama the angriest? Is that I drew a distinction. Well, yes, but in particular that I drew a distinction and said there's a different circumstance for the Christians who are being persecuted, for the Christians who are facing genocide. You know, ISIS is crucifying Christians. They are beheading Christians.
Well, he said we're no longer a Christian nation, Senator,
genocide.
at one point, and he said terrible deeds in the name of Christ. I want to play for you and
he seems angrier by those of us who want to provide safe haven for the Christians being persecuted than he is at the attacks from ISIS. Why is it that this president is so opposed to standing up? Do you know of the current Syrian refugees, only 3% of them are Christians? Why is the president unwilling to defend persecuted
2,184 Syrians that have already come in, only 3% are Christian, 96% are Muslim.
Yeah.
Is this more pervasive radical Islam? And I only have 20 seconds here. I want to play a little bit of the soccer game in the moment of silence in Istanbul. And instead of silence, the crowd started booing and reports they were chanting Allahu Akbar. Let me play that for you and think about, is this a more pervasive mindset than the world is willing to acknowledge, meaning radical Islamists? Play this. That was supposed to be a moment of silence, Senator. Allahu Akbar, booing.
Look, it is heartbreaking, it's dangerous, and as a consequence of the abject failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, the Islamists are winning in many parts of the world. The Obama-Clinton foreign policy toppled Libya, and radical Islamic terrorists took over. They toppled Mubarak in Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood took over. Their approach is undermining the safety and security of this country. It's making the world much more dangerous.